The horse had broken 4 men's bones in a single week, and the widow walked straight toward him, alone, at midnight, without a lantern. Nobody in the valley could explain what she said to that animal. Nobody was close enough to hear. But by morning, the stallion stood perfectly still at her fence post, waiting, and by the following dawn, the thunder of 500 horses shook the earth outside her gate. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something, because this story is unlike anything I've told before. There's a moment in this tale where a woman chooses silence over screaming, patience over panic, and that single choice changes the fate of an entire region. Do you believe that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the most dangerous one? Drop your answer in the comments, and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I read every single one. If this kind of story moves you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will stay with you long after the video ends. Now, let me tell you about Marin Callaway, the stallion they called Ashen, and the 500 soldiers who had no idea what they were riding into. The Valley of Drenwick sat between 2 ridgelines so steep that winter didn't leave until well into May. The people there were careful people, deliberate. They built their fences deep, their root cellars deeper, and their opinions deepest of all, packed so far down inside themselves that a stranger might spend a whole year in Drenwick and never know what anyone truly believed about anything. Marin Callaway had lived there her entire life, which meant she understood the silence better than most. She was 34 years old and had been a widow for going on 2 years. Her husband, Pel Callaway, had died of a lung sickness that took him slowly and then all at once, the way those things tend to go. He left her the farmstead, 43 acres of decent grazing land, a mule named Birchwood who was older than good sense, and a reputation as a woman who kept her word. That reputation was, perhaps, her most valuable inheritance. The farmstead sat at the eastern edge of Drenwick, where the valley opened up toward the lowland road. It was a position that had once seemed like a blessing. Easy access to the trading post, the mill, the small congregation that gathered every Sunday in a building that was too cold in winter and too hot in summer, but beloved nonetheless. Now that Pel was gone, that position felt more like exposure. Marin's nearest neighbor, a widower named Croft Aldine, was a quarter-mile up the ridge and hard of hearing. The farmstead was, for all practical purposes, alone. She had learned to be comfortable with that. What she had not learned to be comfortable with was the stallion. He had arrived in Drenwick 3 weeks earlier, brought by a livestock trader named such who'd purchased the animal at an estate auction 2 counties over. The horse was enormous, 17 hands, charcoal gray with a white star on his forehead, built like something that belonged in a painting rather than a paddock. Such had called him a prize. The first man who tried to saddle him called him something considerably less flattering from the ground with a dislocated shoulder. After that, 2 more men tried. One came away with a broken wrist. The other, a younger man named Dale Ferris, ended up with 3 cracked ribs and a humility he hadn't possessed before. The 4th attempt ended with the stallion clearing a 6-rail fence and disappearing into the eastern pastures, which happened to border Marin Callaway's property. Such and several of the Drenwick men had spent the better part of 2 days trying to corner the horse without success. The animal was not merely wild. He was strategic about it. He seemed to understand where men would position themselves, and he moved to deny them every angle. Old Croft Aldine watched from his ridge and declared the horse cursed. The minister said nothing, which in Drenwick amounted to agreement. By the 3rd day, Ashen, as the men had started calling him, for the color of his coat in low light, had settled into the wide stretch of open pasture along Marin's eastern fence. He grazed there with an air of total indifference to the chaos he had caused. Such was furious. The horse represented significant money and also significant embarrassment. Marin had watched all of this from her kitchen window and from her porch and from behind her fence line. She had watched the men shout and rope swing and strategize. She had watched the horse respond to every escalation with a precisely calibrated counter-escalation, and she had formed an opinion that she kept, in the Drenwick way, entirely to herself. On the 3rd night, after the men had gone home frustrated, she went out to the fence. She did not bring a rope. She did not bring grain. She brought nothing at all. She stood at the fence post nearest to where the horse was grazing, and she was quiet for a very long time. Not the quiet of someone waiting for something to happen. The quiet of someone who has already arrived somewhere and is simply present in that place. The horse lifted his head and looked at her. She did not move. He went back to grazing. She stood there for what might have been 40 minutes or might have been 2 hours. She was not the kind of woman who checked time obsessively. And then she went back inside and went to sleep. She repeated this the following night, and the night after that. On the 4th night, the horse walked to the fence. Nobody saw it happen. That was important later when people tried to reconstruct events and assign meaning to them. Nobody witnessed the moment the stallion called Ashen walked to the fence and stood within arm's reach of Marin Callaway. There were no witnesses to confirm or deny what was said, if anything was said, or what occurred in the space between a woman and a horse in the dark of a spring night with the ridgelines black against a sky full of cold stars. What people saw was the morning after. Such arrived at first light with 2 of the Ferris boys, Dale's older brothers, Croft and Renwick, who had the combined build of a small barn and a new rope and a plan that mostly involved not getting kicked. He found the stallion standing calmly at Marin's fence gate, not pacing, not snorting, standing the way a well-trained horse stands when it is waiting for someone it knows. Such stopped walking at a considerable distance and stared. Renwick Ferris said quietly, "That ain't the same horse." It was, of course, the same horse. The white star on the forehead was unmistakable, but something in the animal's posture had changed so fundamentally that the observation was not entirely wrong, either. He was not tame, not in the way that word usually gets used, but he was present in a different way, contained rather than restrained, like something that had made a decision. Marin came out of her house at 7 in the morning with a coffee cup in her hand, nodded at Such and the Ferris boys with the economy of greeting that was standard in Drenwick, and unlatched her gate. "I'll buy him," she said. Such opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the horse, looked at Marin. "He broke Dale's ribs," he said. "I know. He's not rideable. I can't even guarantee he won't." "Name your price," Marin said. The price Such named was lower than what he would have asked 2 weeks earlier, before the injuries and the fence clearing and the general humiliation. He named it in the manner of a man who has begun to doubt his own instincts and wants the whole situation to be someone else's problem. Marin paid it without negotiating. That, more than anything else, made the men uneasy. In Drenwick, you always negotiated. The failure to negotiate was either the sign of someone very rich or someone who knew something you didn't. Marin Callaway was not particularly rich. She led the stallion into her paddock without a rope. She walked, and he followed. Such watched this with his hat in his hand and an expression that suggested he was reconsidering several things simultaneously. "What do you want him for?" Renwick Ferris asked. Marin latched the paddock gate and looked at the horse for a moment. "Company," she said. She went back inside. The story moved through Drenwick the way all stories moved in that valley, carefully, with layers added at each telling. By the time it reached the trading post, the detail that Marin had walked out without a rope had become the detail that Marin had whispered something to the horse that made him go still as a stone. By the time it reached the Sunday congregation, the whisper had become something stranger and harder to categorize. People did not use the word she had whispered so much as they used the phrase something she said, with the emphasis on something carrying a weight that the word itself couldn't quite support. Old Croft Aldine said, not unkindly, that Marin had always had a way with animals. Her husband Pell had said the same, apparently. The minister suggested that some people simply carried a kind of patience that animals recognized before people did. These were the reasonable explanations, and most of Drenwick settled into them the way you settle into a coat that almost fits. Not perfectly comfortable, but better than being cold. What nobody in Drenwick knew, what Marin had no particular reason to share, was what she had actually understood about the horse. She had understood, after 4 nights of watching, that Ashen was not violent by nature. He was violent by experience. There was a difference that most people missed because they were too focused on the violence itself to investigate its origin. She had recognized the way he positioned himself in a field, always with his back to a natural barrier, always with clear sight lines on 3 sides. She had recognized the way he assessed every approach, not with aggression first, but with assessment, and then aggression only when assessment produced a threat signal. She had recognized it because she had spent 2 years developing those same habits. Grief does that, if you let it work on you long enough. It teaches you to position yourself carefully, to assess before you act, to reserve your reactions for situations that genuinely warrant them, because you have learned, at significant cost, that not everything does. The horse had been mistreated. She didn't know the details, and she didn't need them. The evidence was in his posture, his eyes, the particular way he flinched at sudden sounds from his left side, which suggested, to someone paying attention, that the worst of whatever had happened to him had come from that direction. She had not whispered any secret to him. She had simply stood on the other side of a fence, in the dark, night after night, being exactly what she was, a person who was not going to hurt him, and who was patient enough to let him figure that out at his own pace. On the fourth night, when he walked to the fence, she had placed her hand on the rail, not toward him, just on the rail, and spoken 2 sentences in a low, even voice. "I know what it's like," she said. "Nobody's going to do that to you again." Whether a horse can understand those specific words is a question that falls outside the scope of this story. What is within scope is what Ashen did. He stood at that fence for another hour, and he did not move away. The morning she bought him, she was not thinking about soldiers. She was not thinking about the lowland road or the ridge or anything beyond the fence line of her 43 acres. But 3 days later, a man named Aldrich Weston rode up her track on a sweating horse with dust on his coat and something urgent in the way he was holding the reins. Aldrich Weston was the region's land registrar, a title that sounded administrative and was, in practice, the closest thing Drenwick had to a government official for 200 miles in any direction. He was a thin man in his late 50s with the anxious, careful look of someone who had spent decades knowing more than he could say about more than he could fix. He rode a horse named something that nobody used. Everyone called the horse Clerk, because it seemed appropriate. He dismounted at Marin's gate and did not open it himself, which was the correct thing to do when approaching someone's property in Drenwick. You waited to be invited. Marin came to the porch. "Aldrich." "Marin." He pulled off his hat. "I need to speak with you. About the deed." She came down to the gate and opened it, and he tied Clerk to the post and followed her to the porch, where she poured him water from a clay pitcher without asking whether he wanted it. He drank half of it before he spoke. "You know about the Meridian Compact," he said. "I know of it," Marin said. The Meridian Compact was the kind of document that most people in the valley knew about the way they knew about weather systems that had struck before they were born. It had shaped the landscape they lived in without being directly visible in daily life. It was a treaty, roughly 60 years old, between the 3 major landholding families of the wider Drenwick region and the Territorial Military Administration. It had established, among other things, the terms under which military forces could move through private land during periods of civil unrest. The current period, Aldrich explained, with the careful precision of a man choosing words for a legal record he was composing in his head, was being designated a period of civil unrest by the Territorial Administration. "What kind of unrest?" Marin asked. "The kind that the administration defines," Aldrich said, which was not an answer, and both of them knew it. What he was able to tell her, and what he told her with the specific, careful unhurriedness of a man who understood that some information needed to be delivered in the right sequence, was this. A commander named Garrison Thrace was moving a column of 500 soldiers through the valley corridor. The column was traveling from the northern garrison to a reassignment point 70 miles south. The route, as mapped under the Meridian Compact, passed directly through the eastern pasture land of Drenwick, which meant directly through Marin's 43 acres. Under the compact, Aldrich said, they have the right of passage. 7 days for the column to move through. During passage, the landowner cannot impede military movement and is entitled to compensation at rates established in the compact schedule. He paused. The rates are from 60 years ago. They are not favorable. What happens to the land during passage? Aldrich looked at his water cup. 500 soldiers and their horses. Supply wagons. In May, when the ground is still soft from snowmelt. Marin was quiet. Across the paddock, Ashen was watching them from the far fence, not with the aggressive focus of his first days, but with the particular attentiveness of an animal who has learned to pay attention to conversations that happen near gates. "When do they arrive?" she asked. "The advance rider came through this morning. Column is 2 days out." He looked up at her. "I wanted you to know before they camped on the low road tonight." "Is there anything in the compact?" Marin said, in the tone of someone asking a question whose answer they suspect but have not yet confirmed, that specifies the sequence in which they must cross. Aldrich's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Marin had spent enough years in Drenwick to read almost imperceptible shifts. The compact specifies rite of passage, he said. It does not specify sequence of approach or terms of entry. Then they need to come through the gate. That would be customary, yes. And the gate is mine to manage. There was a pause. Aldrich was a man who understood the law with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of reading documents written by people smarter than the situations they were trying to anticipate. He was also, underneath that precision, a man who had watched Drenwick get carved up incrementally for 20 years by decisions made in administrative offices 200 miles away, by men who had never seen the valley's ridgelines or the color of its pastures in early morning light. The compact does not address gate management, he said, directly. Then I'd like to speak with Commander Thrace before the column enters my property. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. He had known Marin since she was a child, had processed her parents' deed, had witnessed her marriage to Pell, had registered the transfer of the property after Pell's death. He was not a sentimental man, but he was an observant one. He's not the kind of man who meets with landowners, Aldrich said. He's the kind of man who sends a rider ahead to inform landowners. He already sent a rider ahead, Marin said, to inform me. So the informing is done. Now I'd like a meeting. Aldrich put his hat back on. He looked out at the paddock, where Ashen had moved closer to the fence, not threateningly, just closer. The horse's attention had a quality to it that was difficult to name precisely. Purposeful, maybe. I'll carry the request, Aldrich said. Appreciate it. He untied Clerk from the post and was halfway down the track when he stopped and turned back, looking at the horse in the paddock. Is that the stallion that broke Dale Ferris's ribs? That's Ashen, yes. Aldrich studied the horse for another moment. The horse looked back at him with complete composure. Seems different, Aldrich said. He is, Marin said. He rode away down the track, and Marin stood on the porch and looked at the eastern pasture. Her eastern pasture, 43 soft May acres, and thought about 60-year-old documents and the distance between the letter of a law and its spirit. Then she went inside and began writing a letter of her own. The letter was addressed to a woman named Ottoline Voss, who lived in the administrative seat of the territorial capital and who had, 3 years earlier when Pell was still alive and the world was shaped differently, been instrumental in establishing a legal precedent regarding water rights on the South Fork of the Drenwick Creek. Ottoline was a solicitor. She was also, in the way that women in positions requiring twice the competence for half the recognition tend to be, methodical to a degree that other people sometimes mistook for slowness and then deeply regretted. Marin had known her for 7 years. They had corresponded sporadically, the kind of correspondence that looks thin on volume but carries significant weight per letter. The letter Marin wrote was 2 pages long and covered the following: the Meridian Compact, the rate schedule, the phrase terms of entry and its legal ambiguity, the status of the eastern pasture under current deed registration, and a specific clause in the compact's original text that Marin had found that morning in the document copy Pell had kept in the cedar chest with the farm records. The clause was in the 11th paragraph, in language that was slightly different from the rest of the document. A difference Marin suspected was the result of a late addition, inserted at the insistence of one of the original landholding families as a condition of their signature. It read, in summary, that any landowner whose property constituted more than 15% of the total corridor acreage required for passage retained the right to negotiate terms of entry as a condition of access. 43 acres was approximately 18% of the corridor. Marin had checked twice. She sent the letter with the morning mail rider and then went to work on the farm, because farms do not pause for legal strategy and because physical work had always helped her think. She split wood. She checked the fence line along the north boundary, which had a post that had been leaning since February. She fed Birchwood, the ancient mule, who received his oats with the serene indifference of a creature who had long ago concluded that the world's complications were not his problem. She spent time in the paddock with Ashen, who had begun to accept her proximity with what she could only describe as deliberate trust, the kind that knows it is a choice and makes it anyway. In the late afternoon, Such appeared at her gate. He did not open it. He waited. She went to the porch. The advance rider for Thrace's column, Such said, is camped at the Drenwick crossroads. He's been telling people in the trading post that the column will begin entry through the eastern corridor at first light day after tomorrow. That's faster than Aldrich said. Column is moving quicker than expected. He paused. Marin, Thrace is not a careful man. I've heard stories from people in the northern counties. He pushes through, doesn't stop for gates or requests or, did he respond to my meeting request? Such as expression answered before his words did. His rider said the commander does not meet prior to routine passage operations. Routine, Marin said. That's the word used. She was quiet for a moment. The evening light was coming in low from the west, turning the pasture grass gold. Ashen was at the far end of the paddock, and he had turned toward the lowland road, not alarmed, but oriented. The way an animal orients towards something it has identified. Tell me about Thrace, Marin said. Such, who had a trader's knowledge of regional politics that was broader than most people gave him credit for, told her what he knew. Garrison Thrace was a career officer, 22 years in the territorial military. He was not corrupt in the ordinary sense. He did not take bribes or sell information. He was corrupt in the structural sense. He had spent so long inside an institution that rewarded the exercise of authority that he had stopped being able to distinguish between authority exercised and authority deserved. He moved his column through the corridor because the compact gave him the right. He did not think much further than that. He has 500 soldiers, Such said. And you are one person. Yes, Marin said. What are you planning? She considered the question seriously, which was part of what made her difficult to dismiss. She did not wave off concerns or offer reassurances that were not grounded in something real. I'm planning to meet with him, she said. He refused the meeting. He refused the meeting request. He hasn't refused the meeting itself yet, because the meeting hasn't happened yet. She looked at Such. When a column of 500 soldiers arrives at a gate, and the gate is closed and the landowner is standing on the other side of it, that's a meeting. He doesn't get to refuse that. Such looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had moved livestock and negotiated prices and navigated the complicated social architecture of 7 different regional markets, and he was not easily surprised. But he had an expression now that Marin recognized. She had seen it on Aldrich's face too, and on Renwick Ferris's face when he watched her lead Ashen through the paddock gate. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. All right, he said finally. He pulled his coat straight and nodded once. All right. He left, and Marin went inside, and she thought about Pell. She thought about him the way she usually did in the evenings, not with the sharp grief of the early months, but with the quieter company of someone who was no longer present but had left a shape in the air where he used to stand. Pell would have found this situation interesting. He was a man who'd believed, with the simple certainty of someone who'd never needed to argue the point, that the most powerful position in any negotiation was the one where you had nothing left to lose. He had not meant it as a dark thing. He had meant it as a kind of freedom. Marin had thought about that a great deal over 2 years. She went to the cedar chest and took out the Meridian Compact again, and the letter she had drafted that morning, and a second document, a deed survey that Aldrich had filed the previous autumn when there had briefly been a question about the boundary markers on the North Line. She read until the lamp needed filling, and then she filled it, and then she read some more. The response from Autoline Voss arrived the following morning, which was, strictly speaking, impossible given the distance to the capital, but the mail rider had encountered Autoline herself on the eastern road, traveling toward Drenwick for reasons of her own that she had not chosen to explain in advance. She arrived at Marin's gate at mid-morning in a wagon that was slightly better appointed than anything else on the Drenwick roads, driven by a young man named Prentice who handled the horses with the quiet competence of someone for whom horses were a profession. Autoline herself was 51, broad-shouldered, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in the practical way of a woman who has decided that ornamentation is a cost she no longer wishes to pay. She carried a document satchel that was clearly heavy. I was already traveling this direction, she said, by way of explanation, before Marin could ask. There's a water rights case in the southern quarter. Your letter was a coincidence. She paused at the gate. A useful one. Marin opened the gate and they went to the kitchen and Autoline opened her satchel. She had, in the hours since receiving Marin's letter via the mail rider, done what Autoline always did. She had read everything available. She had a copy of the Meridian Compact that was, she explained, a first-generation transcription of the original, and it contained several handwritten notes in the margins that the standard distributed copies did not. The 11th paragraph, the clause Marin had identified, had a marginal note in different ink and a different hand. The note read, "Confirmed binding per signatory review, year 12 post-execution. Requires active assertion." Active assertion, Marin said, meaning the right doesn't apply automatically. You have to invoke it. In writing, before the column arrives at the property boundary. Adeline looked at her. Which means you need to do it today. Can it still be done? The column hasn't crossed your boundary yet. As of this morning, it hasn't. The boundary. She pointed toward the eastern edge of the property, visible through the kitchen window, is the low stone wall where the grazing land starts. Marin looked. The stone wall was original to the property, laid by her father-in-law before Pell was born. It was low but continuous, running the full eastern boundary, and it was clearly visible from the lowland road. What does the invocation require? Adeline pulled a form from her satchel that she had apparently drafted in the wagon during the last stage of the journey. Your signature, a witness signature, the property deed reference, the compact citation, and a statement that you are asserting negotiation rights under the 11th paragraph prior to boundary crossing. Aldrich can witness it. Is he available? I'll send for him. While Prentice rode up to Croft Aldine's Ridge to find Aldrich, who, as it happened, was already on his way down, having heard that Adeline's wagon had come through, Adeline walked with Marin to the paddock where Ashen stood in the morning light. She looked at the horse for a long time. He's the one they were saying. Yes. And you just. Yes. Adeline was quiet. She was not, generally speaking, a person who spent a great deal of time contemplating horses. But she studied this one with the same attention she gave to legal documents, looking for the structure beneath the surface. What did you say to him? She asked eventually. Marin gave the same answer she'd been giving, in its way, to everyone who asked. Nothing that complicated. Aldrich arrived within the hour, read the invocation form with the focused attention of a man who is also mentally cross-referencing 3 other documents, and signed it without ceremony. He then looked at Adeline with the expression of someone who has been in the administrative business long enough to know when a situation has moved to a different level of seriousness. He's going to be here tomorrow morning, Aldrich said. I know, Marin said. Thrace doesn't negotiate. I want to be clear about that. He is not a man who. What does he value? Marin asked. Both Aldrich and Adeline looked at her. Every man values something, she said. Even men who don't negotiate. What does Thrace value? There was a pause. Aldrich thought about it with the careful completeness that he brought to most things. His record, he said finally. He's never had a passage operation flagged for legal irregularity. 22 years, no formal challenges. It's part of how he got the column command. Marin considered this. So a legal challenge, properly filed, would mark his record, she said. It would open an inquiry. Inquiries take time. The column has to reach its reassignment point by a specific date or it triggers a readiness violation at the receiving garrison. Aldrich paused. A contested passage that delays the column would create significant administrative problems for Commander Thrace personally. Not a threat, Marin said. A fact. Technically a fact, yes. She looked at the invocation document. We file this today. Registered, delivered to the column's advance position, and a copy sent to the territorial administration. That last part, Adeline said, with the calm precision of someone who has won difficult cases by understanding exactly which moments matter, is the important part. Thrace gets a copy, and the administration gets a copy simultaneously. He can't make it disappear. The filing took the rest of the afternoon. Aldrich rode to the crossroads with the registered document and delivered it personally to the advance rider, who received it with the expression of a man who had been given something he did not know how to classify. The copies went out by courier to the territorial capital. That night, Marin sat on her porch in the dark and listened to the valley. The ridgelines were black against a sky of considerable stars. Ashen moved quietly in the paddock. Birchwood, the ancient mule, made one considered sound from his shelter and then was silent. Somewhere on the low road, 500 soldiers were camped under those same stars, cleaning equipment and checking horses and doing the ordinary maintenance of an army in transit, unaware that a 43-acre farm with one woman and a formerly dangerous horse had just placed a legally registered document between itself and them. Marin sat with her coffee until it was cold, and then she went to bed. She slept well. She had not expected to, but she did. They came at first light. Marin was already at her gate when the column's outriders appeared on the low road. 2 riders moving ahead of the main body to assess approach and report back. She could hear the column before she could see it. The particular density of sound that 500 horses and their riders and supply wagons produce. A low continuous percussion that you feel in your chest before your ears fully register it. The outriders stopped at the edge of the property boundary. They looked at the stone wall. They looked at the gate, which was closed, and at the woman standing beside it with her arms at her sides. One of them rode back toward the column. Marin waited. The advance took another 20 minutes. The main body of the column was visible now, stretching back along the low road in a line that disappeared around the bend. 500 men and horses, supply wagons, the administrative equipment of a military force in organized transit. It was, objectively, an impressive sight. The sheer quantity of organized force, the banners, the dust rising from several hundred hooves into the early morning air. She had stood at a fence for 4 nights watching an animal that everyone else had decided was unapproachable. She found that this helped. The man who rode to the front of the column and approached the gate was Garrison Thrace. She had not seen him before, but she knew him immediately, not because he looked like what she'd imagined, but because he carried authority the way some men carry a coat they've worn so long they've forgotten it isn't part of them. He was perhaps 60, with the kind of physical solidity that suggested a lifetime of purposeful exercise, and he rode with the ease of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of it. He stopped his horse at 10 feet from the gate. She waited. He looked at her. He looked at the gate. He looked at the stone wall running the length of the boundary. He looked, with slightly more attention, at the paddock, where Ashen was standing at the near fence watching the column with the focused, contained attention that was now, Marin reflected, entirely his to deploy as he saw fit. "You're the landowner," Thrace said. It was not quite a question. "Marin Callaway." "Yes." "You received notification of column passage." "I did. I also filed an invocation of negotiation rights under paragraph 11 of the Meridian Compact. I believe your advance rider delivered the document yesterday evening, simultaneously with the copy sent to the Territorial Administration." Something moved through Thrace's expression, not anger, not quite, but the predecessor of it. The moment before a man decides how to respond to information that has disrupted his map of the situation. "That document is being reviewed," he said. "It doesn't require review to be valid," Marin said. "It requires delivery before the column crossed the boundary. The boundary is the stone wall. The column hasn't crossed the stone wall. The invocation is active. Mrs. Callaway." His tone shifted to something that people who use it usually describe as reasonable and that its recipients usually experience as pressure applied slowly. "I have 500 soldiers who need to reach their reassignment point within a specific time frame. This is a routine passage. The compact exists specifically to facilitate." "I know what the compact exists to facilitate," Marin said. "I've read it, including the marginal notes in the first-generation transcription, which confirm that paragraph 11 is binding and requires active assertion. I asserted it. In writing. Registered. With copies to the administration." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not trying to prevent passage, Commander. I'm invoking the right to negotiate terms of passage. Those are different things." The pressure in his expression shifted towards something more calculating. He had a problem now that was legible to him. A filed document, administrative copies, a timeline. He was running the arithmetic she'd expected him to run, and arriving at the same answer Aldrich had described. "What terms?" he said, and the fact that he said it at all was a negotiation beginning. "3 things," Marin said. "First, the column takes the northern path through the corridor, not the direct eastern route. The northern path avoids the soft May pasture. My land doesn't get ruined." She had walked the northern path with Aldrich the previous afternoon and confirmed it was navigable for a column of this size, adding approximately 4 hours to the passage. "Second, compensation at current market rates for any land impact that does occur, not the 60-year rates in the compact schedule." She had the current market figures from Autoline, written on a card in her pocket that she did not need to reference because she had memorized them. "Third, written confirmation from your quartermaster that the column's supply wagons will stay on the established road and not cross my northern fence line." Thrace looked at her for a long time. Behind him, 500 soldiers waited in the morning air. Supply wagons, horses, the entire organized weight of institutional force paused at a stone wall and a closed gate. Ashen moved along the paddock fence, unhurried, with the particular dignity of an animal who has decided on his own terms what he will and will not accept. "The northern path adds time," Thrace said. "I know. You can still make your reassignment deadline. Aldrich Weston, the land registrar, has done the calculation. He's available to confirm it." Another silence. The thing about men like Thrace, the thing Marin had understood, working through it the previous night on the porch, was that they operated primarily within a framework of what they had the right to do. And that framework felt so total to them that they rarely thought carefully about what they had the capacity to do once someone put something legally valid in the way. He had the right of passage. He also had, if this became a contested legal matter, a record that would be open to inquiry, a timeline that would be flagged, and 500 soldiers who would be standing in a road watching their commander negotiate with a widow over a stone wall. The second option was, in its way, worse for him than the first. "I want it in writing," he said. "The terms. Ottoline Voss, solicitor, is at my house," Marin said. "She can draft the agreement in 30 minutes. He looked at her once more, a long, evaluating look, the kind that is trying to find the angle it has missed. She looked back without blinking, without shifting, without any of the small adjustments people make when they are waiting for someone else to define the terms. 30 minutes, he said. He dismounted, handed his reins to a rider, and walked to the gate. She opened it. The agreement took 40 minutes, not 30, because Thrace's aide, a careful young man named Lund who turned out to be genuinely good at reading documents quickly, had 2 technical objections to Ottoline's initial language, and Ottoline agreed with both of them and revised accordingly, which created a brief moment of mutual professional respect that was, in its way, the most unexpected development of the morning. Thrace signed it. Marin signed it. Ottoline witnessed. Aldrich, who had arrived before dawn and been waiting in the kitchen with coffee and his own copy of the compact, witnessed as well. The column took the northern path. It took most of the day for all 500 soldiers and the supply wagons and the administrative equipment to move through the corridor, following the northern route around the soft May pasture. Marin watched from her porch for a while and then went about her work, because watching an army move past your fence for 8 hours is, after the first hour, less dramatic than it sounds. Ashen watched with more sustained attention. He tracked the column's movement along the ridge with the focused interest of an animal who has assessed a situation and arrived at conclusions he is keeping to himself. He did not make any aggressive gesture. He did not retreat to the far fence. He stood at the near side of the paddock and observed, with the kind of presence that several of the passing soldiers noticed and commented on to each other. Thrace did not speak to Marin again before his column completed passage. He rode through with his officers near the front, and he did not look toward her porch, which was the kind of not looking that is its own kind of acknowledgement. Ottoline stayed for another day to complete some additional paperwork related to the water rights case that had allegedly been her original reason for traveling. She and Marin sat on the porch in the evening and talked about the case, and about Pell, and about a few other things, the way women who have known each other for a long time talk, when there is no performance required. "You knew he would negotiate," Ottoline said. "I knew he'd calculate," Marin said. "It's the same thing, for a man like that. When the math comes out on the side of negotiation, he negotiates. What if the math had come out differently?" Marin was quiet for a moment. Then the inquiry would have been interesting. Aldrich said there are some aspects of the compact's original execution that have never been properly tested in an administrative context. Ottoline smiled, which was not something she did frequently or casually. "You'd prepared for that outcome too." "I'd prepared for several outcomes." Aldrich filed the passage agreement with the Territorial Administration the following week. The document established, for the first time in the compact's 60-year history, a precedent for current market rate compensation in corridor passage negotiations. Marin did not entirely understand what this would mean for future landowners in the valley, but Aldrich explained it with an expression that suggested it was significant. The compensation Marin received from Thrace's quartermaster covered the repair of the north fence post that had been leaning since February, with enough left over to buy 2 additional acres of grazing land on the south side of the property. She did not buy them immediately. She thought about it carefully for several weeks, which was the Drenwick way. Then she bought them. Summer came into Drenwick the way it always did, slowly and then completely, the ridgelines going from black to green to the particular dense fullness of July, the creek coming down from snowmelt to a sustainable level, the days extending until the light lasted long past what felt like a reasonable hour. Marin's farm settled into the season with the specific quality that Pell had always loved about this land, the way it responded to attention. Not dramatically, not in the large gestures that made for good stories, but in the steady accumulation of small returns that rewarded consistency over excitement. She planted the South acres, part of them in clover, part in a grass mix that Aldrich's catalog indicated would be better suited to the soil composition there. It was a long-term investment. Clover takes 2 seasons to establish properly. She was not, she had decided, planting for the short term. Ashen had changed through the spring and into summer in ways that were difficult to describe but unmistakable to observe. He was not tame. She did not want him tame, and he did not seem to want it either. But he was present in the world in a way that felt different from his first weeks. He moved through the paddock with a kind of authority that was not aggression but was not submission either. It was simply the confidence of an animal who has determined that this is his place and who is occupying it on his own terms. She rode him for the first time in late June, which was not something she had planned on a specific timeline. It simply became clear one morning that it was time. He accepted the saddle with the measured tolerance of someone agreeing to a proposal they've already considered and found acceptable. They rode the perimeter of the farm, which took about 40 minutes at a walking pace, and then came back to the paddock gate. She told Croft Aldine about it the next day. He didn't say anything, which in Drenwick meant a great deal. Such stopped by in July, ostensibly to ask about the South acres, but actually, she understood, to check on the general situation, which was his way of expressing concern without calling it that. He looked at Ashen in the paddock for a long time. "I got a letter," he said, "from a breeder 2 counties over. He heard about the horse. Offered to buy him. What did you tell him?" "Told him the horse wasn't mine to sell." He glanced at her. "But I wanted you to know the offer exists. It's a significant figure." "I know." He waited. "He's not for sale," Marin said. Such nodded. He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, like a man confirming something he had already suspected and found, on the whole, appropriate. Word had spread through the region about the passage negotiation, the way word spreads in rural places, slowly but thoroughly, like water finding its way through stone. Marin did not seek it out and did not encourage it, but she did not deflect it either when it came to her directly. A woman from the southern quarter came by in August to ask about the compact language. Marin directed her to Aldrich and to Adeline's contact information, because she was not a solicitor and she understood the difference between having navigated something and being qualified to guide someone else through it. The woman came by twice more that summer, and each time Marin told her the same thing. The information was available, the legal framework existed. The question was whether she was prepared to sit with uncertainty long enough to see what moved. Whether that advice was about land rights or something else, she left it to the woman to determine. The evenings in late summer were long and golden. Marin had developed a habit of sitting on the porch after supper with something to read, and then not reading it, just sitting with the light and the sound of the valley settling into evening. Ashen came to the fence on these evenings with a regularity that had the quality of preference. She would bring her coffee or her water, and he would stand at the fence line, and they would keep each other company in the way that is possible between creatures who have come to understand the particular frequency the other one operates on. She thought about Pell on those evenings, less sharply than before, with more room around the thought. She thought about nothing having been lost that couldn't be, in some way, recovered, not replaced, not restored exactly, but recovered, found in a different form, turned into something that was hers in a new way. The stars over Drenwick came out slowly, ridge by ridge, in the order they always had. She stayed on the porch until she was ready to go in. "There's something I want you to sit with before this video ends." Marin never raised her voice. Not once. Not when the advance rider came with his announcement. Not when Aldrich warned her that Thrace was not the kind of man who listened. Not when 500 soldiers appeared on the low road with all the institutional weight of the territorial military behind them. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. She had done something that most people, when they feel threatened, forget is an option. She had gotten quiet, gotten specific, and gotten prepared. The horse understood it before any of the people did. That's what the story is actually about. Not the soldiers, not the compact, not even the negotiation. It's about the fact that Ashen recognized in Marin something that takes a long time and a particular kind of loss to develop. The quality of someone who has already survived the worst thing and is no longer making decisions from fear. Grief changes you. It can take things from you that you never fully recover. But sometimes, if you give it enough quiet, enough space, enough honest attention, it gives you back something else in return. A steadiness, a kind of presence, the ability to stand at a fence in the dark and simply be exactly what you are, without performance, without pretense, without needing the outcome to be certain before you begin. The most dangerous thing in that valley, it turned out, was not the stallion nobody could touch. It was the woman who understood why he was the way he was and chose to stand there anyway. If this story moved you, if there's a part of it that felt like something you needed to hear today, leave a comment and tell me about it. Tell me your city. Tell me what you're carrying right now. And if you want more stories like this, you know what to do. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.